Hey everybody, this is R.L. Parker, epic fantasy and dark fantasy author. If you have watched my other videos so far, you probably notice I'm wearing the same shirt in all of them, and I've got the same backdrop in all of them, and you may have pieced together the fact that I'm doing all of these in one day. They'll be edited, very minor edits. I'm trying to do almost all of these as one-shots because that's just easier for me, and I prefer to just talk off the cuff and not have a script. If that doesn't appeal to you, sorry, I'm just not the channel for you. This is going to be a much more informal video, but it's also going to be kind of a fireside chat style conversation about the world of Ayrelon, the fictional world. So this could benefit a whole number of people. Either you've read my books and you want to learn more about the world, or how I came up with it, where the ideas and concepts came from, or you're a dungeon master and you're looking for, examples of how other people have constructed fictional worlds that, would give you inspiration to create your own fictional world for use in your dungeon mastering. Or maybe you just want some little tips and tricks or little inputs, something that'll trigger a little spark of imagination for you to tweak your world in some way. Or maybe you're a writer and you're looking for maybe more interesting ways to do world building. Or you're a writer that wants to possibly write a world set within Ayrelon because you've read my novels and liked them, or what have you. Any number of people could possibly benefit from this. But as I said, it's going to be informal. I say that because those of you that know me personally will realize that I vape because I have high-functioning anxiety, and this calms me down. I'm allergic to anxiety meds, can't use them. So I had to find something else. This isn't CBD or anything, although I'm not opposed to that. My day job, I work government contracts that sometimes require a security clearance, so I can't do anything that would put that stuff at risk. And I also have a beer for this session. This is Mind Haze Double IPA from Firestone. It's quite nice. I don't drink a lot, but occasionally I do have a beer. I used to drink a lot in my youth. I just don't anymore. So with that out of the way, let's get into this. What is Ayrelon? Where are all these books set? Why do I keep saying that they share a world and they share all of this? And how did I come up with all of this? Well, to start with, I wasn't exposed to a lot of role-playing games or fantasy or anything when I was growing up. We had I grew up in the late 70s, all the way through the 80s, clearly, because this is the 2000s. Come on, Rick. But I grew up at a young age in the 70s and 80s, which means video games weren't as prevalent. They were starting to become a thing. Depending on how much money you did or didn't have growing up, you did or didn't have access to video games, and that's just, that's how it was. I had, we had an Atari, we had a Nintendo eventually, one of the originals. I had a cousin that had like a Commodore, and some of the older gaming systems, like the little dial and the paddle buttons that you could play Pong on. All right, so I played that kind of stuff. The only role-playing game that in my opinion, it's fantasy, but it's not really role-playing, is like the whole Legend of Zelda series. And I played some of those when I was growing up. The original, the second one, Adventures of Link. And I pretty much stopped there. I got into like fighting games and stuff like that from that point on because they were just more accessible. And if I was at a friend's house hanging out and they were playing video games, that's, nobody wants to just sit around and watch somebody play a fantasy game, at least back then. You played, stuff like Mario that you could play together, or eventually things like, once I was in the Air Force, it switched to things like Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter and Killer Instinct and then Doom and Quake and, that kind of stuff. So I didn't really get exposure to that stuff, and in large part, I was intrigued by the concept of Dungeons and Dragons in the 80s, but I was still a child, and my mother disagreed with the concept. Basically, there was religious reasons that she was against it. And that's her call. She was my mom. She had her choices to make, and she was in charge of my life at that point. So I didn't really get exposed to it until I joined the U.S. Air Force. So there's a lot of camaraderie in a situation like the military. But at the same time, most of it was because, I was working 12-hour night shifts, and as long as we got our job done the right way, it meant that we were sitting around a lot waiting for things to happen at night. And I was in a communication center. Hold on a second. I was in a communication center. We were handling message traffic between bases, and this was 1992, 93, that time frame. And if you were alive back then, you'll know very well that email didn't exist, right? The internet was fledgling. The web browsers hadn't really even been invented yet. If you were doing anything online, it was usually on a BBS that you had to dial into, and it was specific to that thing. And like it was ASCII art, and you didn't have, right? It was a whole different world. So the Air Force had a messaging system that lived outside of that, and it was mainframe based. But once bases started closing down for the day, you didn't have a lot of message traffic unless it was something emergency or like world problem, like related, like deployment type of thing. So for the most part, once our night shift really kicked off, we closed out all the work from the day shift, and then we didn't have much to do the rest of the night. So we'd sit around and talk. A lot of our sitting around talking was all new to me, right? It was guys talking about fantasy novels that they read, or their game session that weekend in D&D, or some new role-playing game that they were trying. And it was fascinating because it was totally new. Like I hadn't even had a chance to read somebody like Tolkien growing up. The only book that I read that classifies as fantasy would have been The Crystal Cave, right? The story about King Arthur, but from Merlin's perspective, with a more realistic Merlin, or a more real world-esque version of Merlin. So, and that was good, but that was my only exposure to it. So they immediately, handed me a pile of novels from people like Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, R.A. Salvatore, Ed Greenwood, Tolkien, the whole Tolkien, series. And I started plowing through them, right? I'd read them during work when there was no work to do. I'd read them at home. And that was like early 93 where all that started. And then I want to say within about 6 months, I had grown so interested in what was going on that they invited me to join a D&D session. So I went to it was a lot of my coworkers. It was like 3 or 4 of them, and then people they knew or lived with. So started going to their house to play D&D. My first character was a ranger mage because I wanted versatility because I didn't really know the game that well. I was new to it, and I had gotten a player's handbook from a local store that one of them drove me to because I didn't know how to even go about any of this. Read through the entire book, showed up at my first game session thinking I knew everything. Totally did not. But what I learned in that was that, and this is more for people in this watching this video that might not have played it yet, imagination is key, right? If you find a good group, it's not just about rolling dice. It's inventing your way through problems, right? In the context of what your character would be capable of doing and what they would think of doing, right? So it's, you've got a 4'11" elven ranger running towards a fight, who focuses, in this version of him, he focused on dual wielding short swords. And, he had a couple like 1 or 2 mage spells that he knew because he was ranger mage. But those were limited. You only cast 1 or 2 a day and you were done. This was 2nd edition D&D. But, you're running towards this freaking ogre that's like 7.5 foot tall. And you're like, well, I could just roll dice. I could say I'm attacking, but can I do something more inventive? And this was like the first major combat I got into with this guy. And the DM's like, yeah, sure. I was like, all right, I'm going to run, and I'm going to drop down to my knees and slide on my knees between his legs and cut his gash into both of his thighs. So, dex check, strength check, I rolled a hit for each weapon individually and all this stuff. And it was a successful attack. I did some decent damage to the guy, and, we ended up winning the fight. And I'm not saying that because that was impressive. It's totally not. Like every other freaking melee player in the world does that eventually. But I hadn't exposed to that. I wasn't exposed to that at that time. That was my first combat. I hadn't seen anybody else do it. To me, that was like, this would be cool. So I did this would be cool thing, and it worked. Right? And that's something you can't do in a video game. Right? We still today don't have video games that are up to the quality where you can do something like that. and have it work or have it make the impact that you can in D&D or Rollmaster or any of the other role-playing games. There's a lot of them, by the way. So it really sparked my imagination. And after a couple months of gaming with these guys every single weekend, I got to the point where I wanted to game more than that. And one of them was like, well, why don't you just do it? Why don't you run your own sessions and, get another group? You can still game with us, just form your own group and you can game during the week too, or on Sundays or whatever, because we gamed on Saturdays. I was like, that's a good idea, but I don't know how to do it. And they were like, well, get a Dungeon Master guide, and, you've seen what Tom's doing, so just, go based off of that. I was like, well, what setting do I use? Where does this all take place? And they're like, well, make your own. Or you can buy modules and run those. And I was like, I don't want scripted. I don't want a piece of paper telling me what I'm having my players do. Right? I want to come up with it on my own. I want it to be creative, right? I want to lean into this imagination side of things that I'm experiencing with you guys. So ultimately, I started daydreaming about it in my spare time. When I was at work, I would write down little ideas and concepts, and I would stew over them. I'm reading these fantasy books. I'm playing this D&D, and I came up with this concept. And at the time, the world was named Terras. It was not named Ayrelon. That's a name I came up with way after I stopped playing D&D. But this world of Terras, or what became Ayrelon, became kind of my baby, right? It just became this fictional universe that I was daydreaming about. I ended up with a roommate named Mike Hawkman. He had his own version of Terras. I'll admit I borrowed his name for a time for my world because I couldn't think of one. But, we gamed in his world. We gamed in mine. They were distinctly different enough that worked. When he ended up moving away, I ended up blending some of the features of his into mine at that time. None of those have persisted to now. But the big deal was that I created this fictional world for the purpose of role-playing games so that I could have fun with friends and make new friends and just live in fiction. I felt like I was living through these novels that I was reading. So, that went on until probably, late 1999 is when I finally stopped gaming in that world. And that was mostly because, a lot of my friends were getting deployed and switching bases, getting reassigned to other bases. I was about to leave the Air Force after 2 terms. My girlfriend at the time, and she was one of the critical players for the years, she moved up north. I'm in Virginia, so she moved up north to New Hampshire to be with her father, and there was family stuff going on up there, and we were just ready to grow apart, right? She had things she wanted to do with her life, and I had things I wanted to do with mine, and they didn't align. We sync back up later, and she's my wife now. But point being, I lost most of my gaming group, and I just didn't have the patience to go build a new gaming group to keep going when I knew I was leaving the Air Force and moving away from that area. I knew I was moving to Richmond a year before I got out of the Air Force. I had jobs lined up. I knew where I was going. So basically it kind of petered off. But that late 90s section from about 95, 96 all the way until 99, I was gaming 5-6 days a week in this fictional world. Well, if you've run a campaign, and for those of you that haven't, this will be news to you maybe, you know that players usually do not do what you want, right? You plop them in a place, or they've arrived at that place, and you give little breadcrumbs and hints of, hey, maybe you should go talk to this sage, or maybe you should go and investigate that tomb, or whatever. Whether or not they do that, it's totally up to them. You can't force them to make specific decisions. It's all individually based. And so you sitting here, and if you've done over preparation, or if you're trying to run a module, right, you've got this thing going over here that that tomb that you have to have them go through for your story to progress. I'd say, from my experience, 9 times out of 10, they're not going to that tomb. Even if you push, especially if you push, they're not going to that tomb. they're going to this village over here. They're going to go beat up the sage rather than talking to him, right? And if you're running a murder hobo campaign, they might try and kill the guy and get information out of his corpse. I mean, who knows? Players are weird. Players do things you will not anticipate. I don't care how smart you think you are. You are going to get thwarted by your players eventually, which is part of the fun, if I'm being honest. But what that forces you to do from a world building perspective is always be ready, to always have the ability to spin up where they're going and quickly whip it together so that when they arrive, it feels like you had planned it. I had players that would join my campaigns and go, "Oh, you seem to always be ready. You know right where we're going." No, I don't. I was a seat-of-the-pants DM. I never planned anything. Because the first few times I tried, I got stomped into the ground by my players. And it was dramatic how different players decided to act compared to what I expected them to do. So you just choose not to do that anymore, and you learn to run seat of your pants, in my opinion. This is the best way to game. Best way to DM. And then it turns into kind of a you versus them. How do you role play to convince them to do what you wanted them to do without them knowing that you're convincing them to do what you wanted them to do? And it's a fun little experiment. Back to the point of world building, though, it makes you develop parts of your world you might not have ever developed, right? I didn't plan on the party going to the capital city of this whole empire today, but now I've got to world build it, and I have to do it in real time. So I start, as you walk up, you see the big pearly gates and blah, 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 and you just keep describing, and you're inventing it as you talk, and you're writing it down, or you've got somebody in your group that's taking notes, or you're recording the session, hopefully, and you're just making it up as you go, trying to be, trying to fit the tone that you're trying to set to the players and trying to express what they see and what they feel and what they smell, right? And until they try and take an action, and then you respond from there. And, oh, look, they're going to a tavern. So who is this tavern owner? Name off the top of your head. What do they look like off the top of your head? And while you're doing that, decide on a backstory. Was this person an adventurer in their past? Did they grow up a slave? Did they grow, right? There's all these things that start firing off in your head that force you to act, to create a fiction, this real feeling world for the benefit of your players. So that's how the world building for Ayrelon got done. It did get renamed. Some locations got changed from what they were back when I gamed back in the day. There's some components that came in from Mike Hawkman, good buddy. Hopefully you see this someday, Mike. Some things that came in from him into my play sessions that I, eventually abandoned and scrapped because I wanted to be my own thing. I wanted to have my own world. Especially his history of his world is awesome. I hope he writes it someday, but it's not the history of mine. So there's a lot of things that I tweaked and manipulated in my head over the years after I stopped gaming. When I moved to Richmond, I couldn't find another group that I liked, so I just didn't do it anymore. Focused on my career, built that career, built a family, right? And now I'm writing. And that's how I get to experience my world now. But that does mean that I have this really deep knowledge of my world without ever doing what a writer would call a world building session, right? I never sat down and just started documenting it all. It's mostly off the cuff, off the top of my head as I'm writing. And as I find that I'm writing something, if I have the mental space at the time, if I'm not inspired to keep writing the next scene, then I'll jump aside and write one of those notes in my Scrivener project so that I have that to reference later. But I do have this really deep world, and we've only started scratching the surface of it for my novels. This is all leading somewhere. This, Bathed in the Blood of Ravens here, see if I can get that on screen, A Destiny and Blood and Magic Book 1. Now, while I'm writing these to be, as standalone readable as possible, this is part of a series, and that does mean that it's going to have an overall plot that continues through the whole series. And it's all about Lawrence Ravencrest, right? I know exactly how he ends up after the last book in the series. I know what happens to him in every book in this whole series. I just haven't had time to write it yet. I know about all the characters that he's interacting with, where they came from, where they're going, which ones are going to have books outside of this, which ones are going to have their own series outside of this. I know where it's leading the kingdom of Arcania, right? I know all of that because it's all in my head. Well, how? No, these aren't campaigns. I'm not writing campaigns. This isn't lit RPG. This is epic fantasy. So how I know it all is that most of the characters I'm writing about are either they are my personal recreations of some of the characters that lived in my world through campaigns, like Gnadly in Dusk. She was a character in a campaign. But it was my wife's character. So I was able to talk to her and say, hey, do you mind if I use Gnadly? It'll be my version of Gnadly, but do you mind if I use her? She was cool. She was funny. I need her for this story. She was, of course, was all game. There's another character in Blood of Ravens named Sarasha that we meet halfway through the novel. Now, she's loosely based on one of my wife's characters named Sarasha, but as I told my wife, that's actually her character's mother. So the real Sarasha will appear eventually. I won't say when. I know exactly when. But the real Sarasha will appear eventually. So I have a little of that going on. There's very few of them, though. Very few of them. The rest, even Lawrence, they were non-player characters in my campaigns. And I don't mean that players ever interacted with young 17-year-old Lawrence. They never did. What they interacted with is what Lawrence will be at the conclusion of his series. What he becomes by then. Because all of my players played in the third era of man on Ayrelon. Bathed in the Blood of Ravens is first or second era of man. And Dusk and Sissy are first era of man. So effectively what I'm writing is all that backstory that I had to come up with as a DM to make my world deep, to give context to things. Why is this castle here? Why is that dungeon here? All of that stuff that I thought up back then as justification for the decisions I was making as a DM, as the personalities of who they were interacting with and why they would have had that personality, as the motivations for things villains were doing, as the reason this kingdom was destroyed or that kingdom grew out of ashes, or all of that background work that I did in my head is now being written as these stories. And that is the beauty of the way that I went about this. Now, would I recommend somebody, another writer, go and game for 10 years without writing and then stew on it for 20 years and focus on their career and then start writing? Not necessarily. Does it work for me? Yes. Sorry, I thought somebody was at my door. So what about the world itself? What details can I share with you in this video? Well, at this point, I still want to try and remain as spoiler-free as possible. But I did mention a couple things off the cuff during my Blood of Ravens video that I said I would get back to, and I forgot to get back to them. The first of which is the Grand Awakening. That is a minor plot point in Blood of Ravens, so I don't mind a minor spoiler. You won't know through this what it really is. You'll know what the characters think it is. So it's mentioned in Blood of Ravens. It's mentioned heavily in Dusk. None of the characters have figured out what is really going on yet. Effectively, though, they call it the Grand Awakening because it's as if every sentient being in the world just woke up all at once, with no recollection of the world's history. Nothing written, nothing in their memories, nothing chiseled into stone that would make any difference to anybody. All of it was gone. They all knew how to live their lives, right? Nobody forgot how to breathe or how to walk or how to eat. Nobody forgot their job. Nobody forgot what they did with their lives, how to adventure, how to cast spells, or whatever they might have known. But everyone woke up all at once from something. Part of these novels is people like Mordecai, super powerful magic user, very prevalent character in Blood of Ravens. Part of these novels is characters like him discovering what is going on with that Grand Awakening. Why did it happen? Who did it? Or what did it? Is it permanent? They just don't know. And most of the people in the world 99.99999% of them going on for almost infinity, have no clue this thing even happened. It's only the super old and powerful that are able to deduce that this happened. And some of them have found a way around it. I won't say who. You'll need to read Dusk to see some clues. So that's the Grand Awakening. That's why the first era of man starts when it does, is that's the start of recorded history at the Grand Awakening. And then that goes on until Arcania was founded, and all the major scribes in the world consider that a world power change, so that becomes second era of man. This is changing the way this world lives. And then, like I mentioned, my gamers back in the day, my D&D days, they gamed in the third era of man, so the aftermath of all the novels that I'm working on. And then I mentioned a couple, like Tor, Toor. What is a Tor? Drakal, the main antagonist of Bathed in the Blood of Ravens, is a Tor. A Tor, hold on for a second. A Tor, if you want to picture one in your mind, if you think of the biggest, tallest, most burly guy you saw in the TV series Vikings, make him about 2.5 to 3 feet taller, take away the Viking part of it, and just make him kind of Nordic and Norse, and you have a Tor. Most of them are dark tan to brown skin. A couple have more light-skinned complexions. The people of the world of Ayrelon don't know the true history of the Tor. All they know is that every Tor they encountered in the open world was living in nomadic tribal societies. They were very brutal. They didn't seem to get along with any other races other than their own. They were very defensive of their lands. They were the largest opponent to the unification of the lands that became Arcania. That is alluded to in Bathed in Blood of Ravens, but not part of the novel. And Drakal is one of them, or was one of them, or I'll let you read to learn more. But little background information that the characters in the novels don't know yet, that I don't mind exposing, is that the Tor were created as servants of the Titans. So I've mentioned a few times in my different books, and at least once in one of these videos, there's a race of Titans that arrived on Ayrelon long before recorded history named the Agthari. The Agthari are a race of Titans that have a direct connection to the spheres of influence that manipulate existence, if you will. For those of you not familiar with like spells in D&D and games like that, it's almost like magic, but the Force. Like, I don't know. It's hard to relate if you haven't played a role-playing game or played a fantasy game of some kind. But they are their access to those spheres of influence are far beyond normal spellcasting. They basically consider themselves gods, and they indeed do receive power from people praying to them. So in essence, they are gods. They created the Tor as basically servants, as forced labor. They manipulated other creatures that were on the world at the time, twisting their bodies to create the Tor to serve them. They created a couple other races too, but this conversation is about the Tor. So the Tor, most of their early existence was very subservient, very willingly subservient to who they considered to be their gods. And as different things happened across the world, mostly Titans versus dragons kind of battles, because the dragons ruled the world before their arrival and were justifiably offended at their arrival. Once those were finally resolved and the Agthari withdrew from interacting directly with the world and or were killed or left and went somewhere else or what have you, depending on the Agthari, there's a different answer. But as they stepped away, the Tor were left more to their own and had to learn how to think for themselves and how to do for themselves. And they just kind of clustered into these tribal units and started traveling around. But they remained very protective of themselves. And as they started interacting eventually with these humans and elves and dwarves and gnomes and whatnot, they became very protective of their lands and their sanctity of themselves. So they're seen more as the, a more violent, almost evil kind of force in the world wherever they currently exist. But in reality, they're just, they're not specifically good or evil. They're like any other sentient being. Whether or not they're good or evil is based on your perception of their actions. So that's the tour. What else? What else? I think that's all I want to cover today. If you have any questions about any of the novels or any of the points about the world, like if you want to know, how I came up with any of the names, or, anything short of what's coming next. If you have questions about Blood of Ravens or Dusk or Sissy or an area that was covered in any of these different novels, reach out to me, right? Leave a comment. Hit me on Instagram or on Facebook or on Twitter, or through my website. I will try and cover it in another video or respond to you directly, whichever seems most appropriate to what's going on. But hopefully you enjoyed this little informal chat, and I hope to see you again.